Hello and welcome to this episode of What in the World is Dyscalculia? I'm Dr. Honora Wall and I'm the host of this podcast, which is sponsored by EduCalc Learning. And if you visit educalclearning.com, you can find lots of information about the training we have for teachers and the services and programs we have for students. You can also visit the Dyscalculia Training and Research Institute at www.thedtri.org for a lot of free information and information about our brand new program, NBD Math. And I'll talk about that at the end of the podcast because I really want to get into our topic today, which I'm calling the Goldilocks problem of dyscalculia, and that is when a student is getting some kind of support at school, but it's not exactly the right kind. It's a little too hot or a little too cold, a little too hard or a little too soft. It's just not quite right. And we're looking for that Goldilocks effect where we get the right kind of support with the right kind of accommodations and the student can succeed. Now, if you've been listening to the podcast or if you've tried any of the accommodations we recommend or you've been to our trainings, you know that I've found for close to a decade now, once we get the support for dyscalculia right, students can succeed very, very quickly. The difference between dyscalculia, the math learning disability, and let's say low numeracy or a weak math foundation is a student who does not have a math learning disability will move away from needing accommodations. And a student who has the learning disability is going to continue to need accommodations. It's really the difference between being a person who wears readers because your eyes are a little older like mine, or you just need help every once in a while with small print, versus someone who has either nearsightedness or farsightedness and always needs prescription glasses. It's not a deficit or a terrible problem that impacts your life. You just need the right prescription, and then you can see just fine. Same thing holds true for dyscalculia. So, why don't we always get the support right? Well, that's a great question with a complex answer, but I'm going to give you some of my thoughts and we'll open this conversation. If you have questions or comments about the conversation, I'd love to hear them. You can comment on my socials. I'm on most social media sites. Dr. Wall _MLD, that's DRWALL _MLD. Or you can find my YouTube channel and leave some comments there or email me. And I'd love to hear your thoughts. But what tends to happen is a couple of very common issues. The first is that we have a student who might have dyscalculia, but maybe they don't have an official diagnosis. So then it becomes difficult to get accommodations because they don't have the paperwork that makes it legally required. And that's a really big issue, which we've discussed in podcasts before. And in that case, sometimes you have a teacher who will give some help in the classroom, regardless of the paperwork situation. Kudos to those teachers. Accommodations are free, and you don't have to wait for approval from someone else. You can just support your students today. If they have suspected dyscalculia, that support is going to include number lines, 1 to 100s chart, a multiplication list, having notes with them during their assessments to trigger their memory so they can keep track of their work. And you're going to see some really great benefits from that. Sometimes when we don't have the right kind of paperwork, a teacher isn't sure what to do and they want to try some different interventions and see if they can make that needle move for the student and get some increased math performance. That's a harder conversation, and I would encourage you to share some research studies and some websites like the two I've mentioned, mine or understood.org or Learning Disabilities Association of America. There's some great information out there. And let's increase awareness on that end. So in those cases, we don't always get support, and that's where we don't have enough. Another situation is when we have paperwork or we have a teacher who wants to be involved and wants to help, but they're not quite giving the right kind of accommodations. So we're not seeing students improve their performance. And that's a really great indicator of whether or not you're offering support that's appropriate for dyscalculia. If you're giving interventions and accommodations and we're not seeing progress, we're probably not doing the right thing. So we want to tweak that. We might be giving extended time. We might be giving more interventions, but not accommodations, especially during assessments. That's never going to help a student with dyscalculia. We might be giving things that are appropriate for different issues. If you're giving appropriate accommodations for dyslexia or dysgraphia to a student with dyscalculia, you're not going to see very much improvement, definitely not over the long term. You might see a few spikes of performance increase. You might see some short-term gains, but you're not going to see a lot of long-term improvement. And that's because dyslexia and dyscalculia are very different. Sometimes they can be comorbid, they can occur at the same time, or there might be some slight overlap in issues, but they're completely different types of neurodivergence. So what helps with one does not help with the other. So in those cases, we have accommodations, but it's too hard. They're not the right kinds, and therefore we're not getting the right kind of help. So what do we do? Well, we keep having conversations with our teachers, with our school counselors. We bring them some more information, and we ask them to try the accommodations recommended for dyscalculia. Sometimes schools are on board and they are willing to do whatever it takes to experiment on their own and see what helps a student. And then we get a lot more buy-in because the teacher can see that now performance is matching the student's abilities, it's matching their effort because we're actually seeing the assessments increase. Sometimes that's not the case, and we have a harder conversation. We have to just keep raising awareness, and we have to keep spreading the recommendations for the right kinds of accommodations. And you can do that through the resources I've already talked about, or encouraging teachers and schools to look up the research on their own. Go to Google Scholar and look up research studies from Brian Butterworth, DeHane, Price and Ansari, Katie Lewis, Michelle Mazzocco, Dr. Myers. There's a lot of researchers out there who have a lot of information that tells us what we should be doing for students with dyscalculia and why. So the more we have these conversations and share this information, the more we're going to see some growth. And how do I know that I'm giving you good information? Well, some of it comes from those research studies and others. I read research articles all the time, and a lot of it comes from many, many years of experience teaching, tutoring, and supporting students with dyscalculia, making recommended accommodations, and then hearing back from families what has worked and what has not for their students. So we do know what works. Here's some of the reasons why. People with dyscalculia have slightly different brain wiring in that parietal lobe, which is where we store our math knowledge. Of course, the human brain is very complex, and we can store knowledge in more than one area or region, which is why multisensory instruction is so beneficial. But we do know the parietal lobe loses math information over time for people with dyscalculia. We also know that they tend to have a weaker or non-existent mental number line, which is why number sense is really tricky. Counting on is really tricky. Remembering facts In fact, families, in fact, fluency. Very tricky. That all comes down to their particular type of neurodivergence. So we use those external tools to support the weaker wiring. And of course, we can do interventions and other activities to strengthen those connections. However, from a pragmatic point of view, if there's a test Friday, if there's a report card grade, we have to pass this class, if there are graduation requirements, in those cases, I'm a much bigger fan of using accommodations to make sure we reach those mastery goals and we're showing math performance and we're not using external barriers that work against students with dyscalculia. So when the support is right, then we see the growth. A lot of that growth is long term also. When I work with students and we have the right kind of support in place and we can keep that support year after year, then over time they require less help because they're learning how they learn. They're learning their strengths and weaknesses and they're maintaining that growth over time. But the minute we take those accommodations away, we lose ground. The same way if someone came up to you and said, hey, you've been wearing those reading glasses for a couple of years now. I think that's long enough, don't you? And you take their glasses away, they're going to go right back to having a very hard time reading text because we haven't fixed their vision. We've simply taken away the external tool that allows them to see better. So I hope this podcast helps you have some conversations with teachers or administrators who might be trying some things, but they're just trying some methods that aren't really designed appropriately for this population, and that's why they're not helping. As educators, we want children to succeed. And as math educators, we certainly want them to enjoy or at least be able to do math well. And hopefully after doing it well, we can get some more enjoyment in there. That's a personal decision if you like math or not. I'm not here to sell you on math as a topic, but I am here to say no matter why you're currently struggling, you can succeed. And no matter why your students are struggling, we can find ways to help them succeed. A lot of that comes from properly supporting dyscalculia. And if you do that right, then all your students are going to benefit. If they did not actually have the math learning disability, they will move away from those accommodations sooner, have a stronger math foundation, and go along their merry way. If they do have the math learning disability, they're going to learn more about how to support themselves, and with your help and the right accommodations, they're going to do just fine. I'm Dr. Honora Wall, and I really appreciate you listening to What in the World is Dyscalculia? I'd love to hear your questions, comments, concerns, and your ideas for future podcast episodes. Thanks for listening.